Good morning, and I'd like to welcome members, our witnesses, and those joining us online to the Economy, Energy and Fair Work Committee's 23rd meeting of 2020. Before I introduce today's witnesses, we will first of all consider agenda item 1, which is a decision to take item 3 in private. Are members happy to take item 3 in private? I will pause for any objections. Right, okay, thank you. So let's move to item 2, which is COVID-19, the impact on Scotland's businesses, workers and the economy. So this is our main item of business this morning, and it's to take evidence on this inquiry on COVID-19. Our first panel will focus on the impact of COVID-19 on Scotland's business, workers and the economy. So I'm pleased to introduce our first panel of witnesses. So can I say welcome to Tracy Black, Director, CBI Scotland, Barry McCulloch, Senior Policy Advisor of the Federation of Small Businesses, Helen Martin, the Deputy General Secretary, STUC, and Liz Cameron, Chief Executive of the Scottish Chambers of Commerce. Now, I'm very glad you can all join us this morning, and I'm going to move to the members, and each member will be bringing forward their questions. So I'm going to start, please, with Alison Harris.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to address my question to either Liz Cameron or perhaps Mulloch in the first instance, and it relates to the furlough scheme. We know this has been an excellent scheme for employers across the country, but it obviously can't go on forever. My question really is in relation to when this scheme does taper off, what do you think is going to happen in relation to unemployment? Do you think we're going to be seeing mass redundancies as this scheme tapers off?
All right. Who would like to go first? Liz, shall we go to you first?
Yeah. Good morning, committee members, and delighted to be involved in the session this morning. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, we're fine, Liz.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, Alison, specifically to your question. There's no doubt that, and we have got both evidence on the ground across 30 chambers in all parts of Scotland, and we've also got evidence from our economic quarterly survey and also our most recent tracker that was carried out, just closed off on the 30th of July, and it gathered nearly 500 responses. And effectively, there is no doubt in our mind, driven by business intelligence and data, that the furlough scheme has masked and is continuing to mask the unfortunate position that we're going to be experiencing over the next 2 months, and that is really high numbers of redundancies and individuals losing their job. There is no doubt in our mind about that. And in actual fact, we did ask the question in the tracker, not yet published, it will be published in the next few days, but we actually specifically said, and that was to say over 500 people, you know, where are you right now in terms of staff? Are you making staff redundant? What are your plans? The impact of furlough? And I'll throw some statistics just out, but I will give you the detail of the report at the end of this week. But that was as of the 30th of July, which is fairly recent. And at that point, you know, if you take a statistic, 89% of the respondents had not yet made staff redundant, with 11% having confirmed they had. Now, in first sight of that, you think that's quite positive. But then when you actually dig a little bit deeper into that, we actually asked the question about when furlough ends. So at that point, 38% intend to bring back 76% of their furloughed employees. 9% may bring back, 51% of their employees. But it was quite clear that in the majority of cases, we're talking about nearly 35 to 40% of the businesses in a collective said that they would struggle to actually bring back all their employees, and we're already planning redundancy packages and redundancy consultations. So there is no doubt, and I just want to just confirm that again, the unfortunate position is that we are going to see a lot of redundancies coming our way in the next few months.
Barry, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, yes, please.
Federation?
Good morning. Yeah, yes, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning, and thank you for the question, Alison. I think without a doubt, the job retention scheme has been a lifeline for employers, and over 730,000 staff in Scotland. And if you look at Glasgow and Edinburgh alone, you have something like 150,000 furloughed people. But I think we probably were all in the position where we were preparing our thoughts ahead of today's evidence session, and I think in light of today's figures, which show a sharp increase in employment and a sharp drop in employment, it gives much pause for reflection. And even within FSB, we're of the view that the UK government now needs to urgently review the plans for furlough after the end of October, because if we're seeing very large increases in employment at a time when we have the furlough scheme in place, then we can assume that when that scheme ends, many businesses will unfortunately have to make their staff redundant. And I think we'll address this issue later on, specifically around redundancy. But as Liz said, there are already signs that businesses are finding it very difficult to keep their staff on with government support.
Thank you, Barry. Helen, from your point of view, where has the STUC standing and feeling?
Yeah, I think we would be in a very similar kind of position. I think it is clear that the furlough scheme saved a lot of jobs when it was introduced. It was an extremely welcome scheme. It's also clear that as the employer contribution element of that scheme has risen, that is already starting to put pressure on jobs, and we're seeing redundancies now coming down the line. And I think, like the other members of the panel, we would be very concerned about what happens when this support is withdrawn. Now, I think we have to think very carefully about what it is that we do in the future. The STUC has argued very strongly that there are certain sectors that will particularly be in need of this furlough support. So we're thinking of sectors like hospitality, or like tourism, perhaps aviation, that have seen a complete drop in demand for their services, and a very fundamental crisis in the industry that is very, very difficult for even strong companies to weather, and therefore targeted government support would be very, very useful. I think we also need to think about how it is that we think about support. So perhaps it is right to also think about how we change the focus of support, maybe away from employers and towards workers, so that workers' pay can be maintained throughout this transition. I wouldn't be arguing that I do still think sectoral support is important, but I do also think it's important to think about how it is that we help workers change from maybe employers who are struggling to employers who are weathering the storm better. And some of that is around our social security system. So I've made the point before at this committee that in other European countries it's actually quite normal to see unemployment support be linked to wages, and to be linked to a percentage of wages in a similar way that the furlough scheme was. So it is a tweak on how the support is delivered, but it is perhaps something that could help us weather the storm and could help us get back to the strong economy that we could potentially still have in the future.
Thank you, Helen. And finally, I'll let Tracy come in as well. And then I see that Gordon MacDonald wants to ask a supplementary on this. So I'll go back to Alison first of all after Tracy, if she wants to respond, and then I'll go to Gordon. So Tracy.
Hi, thank you. No, I would just echo everything that Helen, Barry and Liz have said. Unfortunately, all the signals from members are that we are facing redundancies. I think what is particularly challenging with this crisis is it is all sectors, all parts of the country, rural, urban, large, small. And I think one of the things we really need to look at is in our support mechanisms is, and we're going to come on to this, I'm sure, yes, we must focus on supporting our young people that we know are often disadvantaged in a recession, but also how do we tackle, older people being made redundant. It's going to be all age groups, and we must learn from, I think, past experience. There has to be as much upskilling of our existing workers as it is our young people. But redundancies have already started, and they're going to continue. And I think one of the things we are seeing, which is compounding this, but is essential, is, of course, we need social distancing. It's absolutely essential, but it has a huge impact on our manufacturers in particular. They cannot bring back 100% of their workers, so they're probably operating around 65% of the workforce. That means that they can only sort of get to about 80% of output. So even companies that have got order books there looking to be filled, they can't act because of those constraints on them, and that just can't go on indefinitely. So there's some real challenges there while we're still in the middle of a sort of health crisis.
Thank you, Tracy. Alison, do you want to come back in?
No, I'm fine. Thank you, convener. I found it very interesting. I think the answers were very helpful and honest. And I think Tracy's point at the end, how do we go forward while still maintaining social distancing, I think does highlight more significant problems. But no, thank you. I'm happy.
I'll go in that case to Gordon MacDonald, and then I'll follow that by responses from Liz and Cameron, and then Barry McCulloch. So, Gordon.
Thank you very much, convener. I agree with what the witnesses have said about unemployment. In fact, the Office for Budget Responsibility says UK unemployment could surpass the peaks of the 80s. So, and PwC at the end of July said that roughly 17% of the 9.4 million workers who are currently furloughed probably don't have a job to go back to. So my question is this: why is it that the UK government is withdrawing the furlough scheme at the end of October when it's the 5th biggest economy in the world, according to what we're being told, when France is continuing its support mechanism for 2 years, and Germany has said that it's going to continue its support mechanism to mid-2021. In terms of moving forward, if the UK government isn't prepared to continue a support mechanism for people that are currently furloughed, would you support a call, or what is your view on whether the UK government should have the Scottish government should have borrowing powers in order to introduce its own tailored employment support scheme?
Okay. Well, Liz, I said I'd call you next, so Liz Cameron.
Thank you very much. And I'll perhaps address. You're right in terms of the furlough scheme. We have been, as a business organisation, calling for that particular support to be extended, and we did not land well in terms of getting a win from the UK government in that respect. Therefore, we've changed in terms of our focus to be: can we look at the potential of, it's not a furlough type scheme, some other element of support, financial support, to help possibly customising different sectors. Tracy's right in a remark that this is affecting everyone, all sectors, all sizes of companies and all areas. That said, as a result of the phasing approach that has been adopted by the Scottish Government, there are some sectors that have had to have longer lead time in terms of their ability to trade and to get money coming back in the door to pay our employees. So I would like to see, and we will continue to ask the UK government to consider this, and that is we'd like to see perhaps a different type of scheme, but something that's going to help costs of some of our size of businesses and some of our sectors, enable them to get support over a longer period of time. Well, as I said, that's still in our agenda, and we will continue to make that point. As I said, particularly for those sectors that have got need additional help, and also particularly in the situation we've seen in Aberdeen with regard to the lockdown, where businesses voluntarily closed their premises immediately when they discovered that the unfortunate situation in some of the clubs and bars. So, we need support ready to be able to quickly come in to help businesses in that regard. Your question on borrowing powers, I don't feel competent or have the knowledge to answer your question, whether Scottish Government should have borrowing powers or not. I think that's for the politicians and the Scottish Government and the UK Government to sit down and either negotiate or renegotiate to determine the impact and the value of additional borrowing powers or borrowing powers that the Scottish Government can take to help businesses and help our jobs market. So that's really all I'd say on the borrowing powers question.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Can I move to Barry McCulloch, please?
Thank you. I think if we cast our minds back to when the job retention scheme was designed and then launched, I think we're probably all anticipating a shorter, sharper crisis, when in reality what we're seeing is that certain sectors are looking at a much longer, more uncertain return to normality. And I think we at FSB had been, looking ahead to the summer in May when we moved through the route map and hoping that when we resume economic activity across parts of the economy, that the economy would pick up. And certainly we've seen some uptick, but on the whole, things as the job retention scheme has alluded to, things are fairly grim out there. And just to go back to Lizzie's point about redundancies, our small business index that was published recently, it had a fairly startling statistic in it, where 17% of our members are thinking of reducing their headcount over the next few months. And I think that there's many businesses who face a long journey back to even viability. And I think that what's happening in Aberdeen has put into sharp focus how we need to plan for these eventualities now. Again, we thought we had time before there was going to be additional lockdown restrictions. It turns out that we don't. So we need to think now about how we retain as many jobs as possible, and B, how we support businesses to do that. And certainly the job retention scheme has a part to play in perhaps a different form after November. But also I think there's a lot to be welcomed in the Scottish Government's development of the Scottish Jobs Guarantee Scheme and indeed the UK Government's Kickstart Job Scheme.
Do either of the other contributors, Helen, Tracy, do you want to add anything to Gordon's question? Yeah, so Helen's nodding. Okay, Helen, you go to Helen.
Yeah, I think we would absolutely agree with the points that have been made so far, in that the job retention scheme seems to be playing such a critical role in holding up our economy. It seems completely nonsensical that the UK government are going to take this away, particularly as we move into the winter, which I think is probably one of the more critical times in terms of the pandemic. And there is a very real chance that we could be seeing major lockdowns. We could be seeing a lot of pressure placed on businesses. It may not be across the entire economy the way that we've done already, but there is likely to be pockets. There's likely to be issues that need dealt with. So my question to the UK government would be, well, what are your plans to support businesses and workers through that? Because it can't simply be on individual businesses and individual workers to muddle through, because the resilience in the economy has been weakened already. I would also wonder we were also quite disappointed about the announcements that the UK made around stimulus, and feel that there is so much more that could be done there, particularly if we think about the needs to transition to a low carbon economy. Perhaps it's time to really start seeing large scale investment in these sorts of transformative projects that could help kickstart the economy and give something to build back on. But we also need to recognise, that individual sectors will be struggling, but that they are fundamentally sound businesses. Tracy's point about manufacturing was a very good one. It is very clear that manufacturing is impacted by social distancing, but we can't simply take social distancing away, because if we did that, then we'd be likely to see other wider impacts on the economy as the virus starts to surge. So we need to find a way to square this circle, and unfortunately it does go back to the government to find government support mechanisms, and we just have to realise that there is just no other option but to do that. When it comes to the Scottish Government's borrowing powers, the STUC would be very supportive of the Scottish Government receiving greater levels of borrowing powers with agreement from the UK Government. And we'd also be very interested in looking at issues around local government's borrowing powers as well. You know, writing off historical debt for local government could be something that could be done now that would free up quite a lot of money at a local level that could be used then to support businesses and to support stimulus. We were also quite supportive of some of the calls that were made by the Scottish Government and local government to change capital spend to revenue spend, and we thought that those were sensible things that could be done in the short term as emergency measures to try to help us through. And I think we need to be looking much more widely at the package of measures that could be put in place here to weather this storm, because right now the idea that we're back to business as usual after October, I think, is fanciful.
Thank you, Helen. Obviously, one of the big challenges, and perhaps as we go through this morning, we'll talk about that, is for many businesses, their supply chains are breaking down. And, you know, if they haven't got the supply chains, that affects their ability to function. And if we can't actually keep businesses afloat, then furloughing isn't going to save their jobs. So there's something more going on behind it as well. So I'm going to move to Willie Coffey now. Willie.
Okay, conveners, thank you and good morning everybody. I wonder if I could, if the panel could offer us a view on the impact that the pandemic has had on women in particular, probably especially in the care sector and other areas of the economy with a high representation of women. We've had quite a number of submissions to the committee on this, so I'd appreciate one or two views from the panel on the particular impact that women have had to sustain during this.
Right, who'd like to go first?
Helen.
Helen's waving at me. Off you go, Helen.
Yeah, no, I'm quite happy to discuss this issue. I think what the pandemic has done is really expose some of the problems that already existed in our economy. So the systematic undervaluing of women's labour is one of those problems that has been brought into stark relief. So nowhere is that better illustrated than in the care sector, where these are really quite highly skilled jobs, predominantly done by women, that were paid at the rate of the minimum wage and the living wage if the worker was lucky, and only because of the work that the Scottish Government, employers and unions have really done to try to implement the living wage through procurement. Prior to that, it was very much a sort of minimum wage sector. And what we saw there was a workforce who were particularly under-supported and under-prepared for the pandemic. You know, they had difficulty accessing PPE, they had difficulty accessing testing, they had difficulty accessing sick leave, because actually they didn't necessarily receive anything above statutory sick pay, and statutory sick pay is at such a low rate that it actually represented a barrier to such low-paid workers taking sick pay, taking sickness leave. And that turned out to be a really catastrophic combination of issues for that workforce. And I think we know that there has been a real crisis in our care homes over this period as a result. We also know that, but we knew before the pandemic that there was a problem in social care. We knew that it was very fragmented. We knew that it was underfunded. We knew that we really needed to look at the system that that sort of key public service was being delivered under. And I think really what the pandemic did was shine a light on that. But there are other elements of women's labour that have also been impacted. We know that women are more likely to be frontline workers, but they're also more likely, when they work at home, to have to also take the lead with care responsibilities. And I think that has taken a huge toll on women over this pandemic. And, you know, that balancing of work and care is often extremely difficult, and has been very difficult through this pandemic. So hopefully what we can do here is learn the lessons Hopefully we can take some of the good elements about working from home, working flexibly. I think a lot of employers have learned that these things are much more possible than they perhaps thought that they were, and that we can build business models that are better for women. We can better value their labour, and we can increase pay across these sort of key sectors where women are on the front line but are often very lowly paid.
Okay, thank you. I see Tracy wanted to come in, and Liz is now also indicating. So I'll go to Tracy first and then Liz, please.
Hi there. Yeah, just a couple of points. I suppose one, this is why I think we would say, the schools going back today, and childcare provision has been so essential. We know that still, the majority of children are looked after by the mothers. We also know that caring responsibility often falls on women as well. So it's excellent to see that we have got schools going back. I think there was also a survey put out last week by The Guardian and Oxford Uni, which showed that more women were furloughed than men, even in the same job. Now, we don't know if that was through choice or not. Again, it could be that women put themselves forward more than men because of those responsibilities at home. But I think one of the things we have to make sure is that in our recovery focus, that we don't have sort of unseen consequences. So a lot of the focus we've seen so far, which we support, is around the shovel-ready projects, construction, infrastructure. But of course, they lend themselves generally more to sort of male-dominated industry. That when we're working, and the Scottish Government's working on the recovery plans, that they are thinking about how do you support women, as you say, in some of those sectors that are particularly vulnerable. Care homes have been mentioned, but retail is another one. So this is where the reskilling and upskilling is critical. And can we help women who are maybe being made redundant from retail jobs pivot into new digital jobs, for example? So I think we would absolutely agree that women are particularly vulnerable in this crisis, but that there are opportunities out there through reskilling and upskilling that must be supported.
Thank you. Can we move to Liz, please? Liz Cameron.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's very important that we, I think we're all agreeing that it is a major issue. In fact, I think it was the Institute of Fiscal Studies last week before last, said nearly 47% of women were either potentially going to lose their jobs on a permanent basis and or had quit earlier because of, in fact, other parental responsibilities, and we all know that in the majority of cases, not all of the cases, does lie with the mother or carer. So I think that some of Helen's calls there about looking at we're putting women in this box that says it's low paid jobs, yes, low skilled jobs, to which I do not agree with in terms of the skill set, and I do think that this has highlighted, I think, the value of women in the workplace, and we have all got responsibility to be able to do something about this. The challenge facing us all, though, is the timing of this. Go out now and say, let's increase, salaries by X%. We're trying to save jobs here, so it needs to be a phased approach, but one that we all buy into and agree support, because this is clear. The care sector, tourism, hospitality, retailing, many of these sectors, value the talent and the skill set that females bring to the workplace. So I think it's quite important that we plan ahead quite critically in terms of what females can come into in terms of the retraining element. And I do think that we should have a very, very close look at the care sector in particular, and look at creating new opportunities, not higher skilled positions that these individuals across the patch have been doing for a substantial period of time, do require a set of skills, and they are a high set of skills. So let's revisit some of the jobs that are in these sectors, and hopefully look at retraining many females who possibly are working from home right now, but some of them actually would rather be out into the workplace. So let's look seriously at that retraining element that I think the Scottish Government announced, that they would look at the training allowance. So let's begin to prioritise and focus, particularly on women, to retrain them into positions and jobs that suit their environment, that suit their other commitments, to bring the labour back into the marketplace. It needs to be phased and prioritised in that way.
Thank you, Liz. Can I move to Barry, please? Barry wants to come in.
Just building on the comments made previously, this is an issue that has not received anything like the attention it deserves. And you know, up until this week, due to the closure of schools and childcare providers for non-key workers, childcare responsibilities were shared unevenly in households across the country. And this has had a huge knock-on impact for women that run businesses and for women that work in small businesses. And I think what disappointed us, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, is that the Higgins report and the government's response to Higgins didn't acknowledge the economic importance of these absolutely vital key sectors. We didn't see much on the care sector, the early years sector and the retail sector, which A, provides a lot of jobs for women, and B, also provide a lot of opportunities for women to start and maintain their businesses.
Indeed. All right. Okay, I think then we'll go back to Willie. Willie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, Convener, I think we should move on. That's very helpful, the answers that the panel gave there. If there's a chance to come back later on the whole working from home issue, it'd be useful to try and explore that, but I think we should move on and allow other colleagues to ask their questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Right, so I'm going to go to Richard Lyle, please. Richard.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. We all know that COVID has been a game changer regarding employment and unemployment. Can I ask the panel whether there is a need for a more tailored regional sector response from the Scottish Government, or does this create, as some people call it, a post-COVID lottery? If yes, what sectors and regions need priority action, and what would you suggest to be done?
Who should we go to? Tracy, do you want to lead that one?
Hi, yeah. I suppose at the moment we still don't know exactly how this is going to play out. Like, all the indicators would suggest that we are heading into a difficult and challenging winter. But I think what we don't know is we suspect Aberdeen is not going to be the last local lockdown. Hopefully we are not going to have another national lockdown, but we don't really know. We don't know if there's going to be a complete second wave or if it's going to be localized. And I think therefore where the support needs to be is it just has to be developed to be very nimble and very flexible. I think it does need to have a local element to it, so that if there's a local lockdown, businesses who during that time know exactly where to go for the support. Is it local authorities? Is it Scottish Enterprise? Is it the government? So there needs to be clear direction of what support is available during the lockdown. We've talked about JRS. We have suggested that there should be the potential for sort of localised job retention scheme support, and that. And there also needs to be clear support after the lockdown if required as well. So I think it's hard to say exactly what part of the country, if you're looking at it regional, what it needs to be is flexibility in there that can come in quick and fast when business needs it. On sectors, I think we have a sort of good idea of which ones are probably going to be the most challenged. Hospitality, tourism, retail are obvious ones. We've seen it in aviation and aerospace. But I wouldn't want to sort of say that about everybody else. On a positive, construction and trades associated with construction have come back pretty strong. And per sector does not expect that to continue through the winter months, for example. You know, is it just sort of catching up with sort of the demand of being put on hold for 4 or 5 months? So I think we will need tailored support. I certainly think we'll need localised support if there are going to be more local lockdowns. Sectors, I think we just need to be careful, as we've sort of also mentioned about women and different groups, is that we don't neglect. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Lost you slightly at the end there, Tracy.
Sorry.
Barry, do you want to come in on that one?
Richard asks a really important question, because I think throughout the crisis, the government has engaged in a lot of work that either focuses on preparing guidance for sectors coming out of lockdown, and or providing business support for certain sectors and places. We saw the Falkirk City and Growth deal launched recently, and the Islands deal, and I think that this is an issue quite close to FSB's heart. And if you look at the Scottish economy, it's characterised by significant economic variations between and within places and within sectors, and that manifests itself in terms of self-employment levels, economic output, start-ups, quality of infrastructure, empty units on the high street. No one place is the same, and we are highly concerned about the impact that this crisis will have on local businesses in areas that were already struggling before COVID hit. And this is a point that the Higgins report made very clear, that before the crisis, you look at economic output figures and you compare Edinburgh to some Ayrshire economies, and there's like a 30,000 difference in output per head. And so obviously the crisis is just simply going to exacerbate that. So how do we target action to make sure that those places who will be most badly affected by the pandemic have a sustainable route out of this? And I don't think we've cracked it yet. The Scottish Government's implementation plan talks about aligning resources to a regional level for Scottish enterprise. I have to be honest and say I'm not sure what that means. And I think we're also doubling down on city growth deals without particularly appreciating the framework in which they operate, which is agglomeration economics, where we're hoping that that activity in one place has a wider economic impact. And with people working from home and the economy completely changing, I think we really need to take stock on what the economic strategy will be like, for Scotland, but for local economies across the country.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Richard, you wanted to come back in with a supplementary, so I'll go back to you at this point.
Yeah, Barry touched on the point I want to make next, and we really need to think out the box now, I would suggest. Should any rules or regulations be relaxed to stimulate employment?
Barry, you touched on it. Did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think to be honest, I think we're already seeing this. You've got, at the start of the crisis, you had the chief planner of the Scottish Government introducing temporary relaxation for plan developments. Recently, we've seen those stretch into the months ahead, and so I think you already have government and its agencies contemplating what they could do to make it easier for businesses. And sometimes it's not necessarily about the rules and the regulation, but it's about stopping other interventions that otherwise would increase the cost of doing business. The committee has talked extensively about the deposit and return scheme. The government also paused the introduction of low emission zones, given that air quality levels have dropped below the target levels. And that's not to say these schemes aren't important, they're incredibly important, but it's how you give the economy time to go back to a level where it can contribute to wider objectives. And I think the debate about the green economy is an incredibly important one, but in the conversations that we have with small businesses, many of them are in survival mode, and they're not necessarily in a place where they can have these conversations and discussions about wider government objectives.
Thank you. That's me, convener.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Can I go to Colin Beattie now then, please?
Thank you, convener. I've got a couple of areas I would like to cover. The first is, this committee's taken a broad amount of evidence which suggests a fairly gloomy outlook in terms of operational capacity, staff levels and viability, and a lot of businesses questioning how long they can actually survive. Now, if I just quote, for example, Fraser of Allender, who say that the average Scottish firm expects to only operate at 50 to 75% capacity over the next 6 months. That's quite a broad guesstimate, of course, but even if the most optimistic part of that comes true, it puts considerable pressure on jobs and on the economy itself. Does the committee or does the panel agree with that, with the sentiments that are being received by this committee? And maybe we can start with Fraser Valander, since I quoted their figure.
Okay, who wants to lead? I mean, this comes back to I suppose, the first question around the level of redundancies that are likely to happen if people are operating at that capacity. Do we think those figures that Fraser Valander have said are right? Liz, you've got your hand up. Liz Cameron.
Yes, I do have. Yes, I actually think that they're for an economist and I think all the think tanks that are more expert than we are in the projections. I would actually agree with that's around about the ballpark figure. We're already seeing that, and we mentioned manufacturing earlier. Manufacturing sector already working at, in some cases 50 to 60 to 70% capacity. We're seeing our hospitality industry operating at 20-30% in some cases. So those figures are probably pretty accurate. If we stay as we are right now, I'm saying if we stay as we are right now because we do not know what's ahead in the next few months in terms of whether there's like a second wave or whatever. So I think it is pretty accurate. And in terms of, what can we do about this? That's I think the question from the committee members. The previous question was asked about looking at local regional flexibility and focusing on customised support. I've got 30 chambers, and believe you me, they all put their hand up and say we think that we deserve other support. But I do think that there is a case to be had in terms of looking quite closely at the local support mechanisms and customising the support from government into these areas. It's worked before with the oil and gas industry, and I think we should look at that quite closely. I understand that the Scottish Government have actually done an analysis on this, if you've not already seen it, and again predictions with utilising the economics of all of this, and predictions in terms of which areas across Scotland are more at risk. So I think that's worth having an exploratory look at to see if we can start looking at some development plans. Barry made the point about city deals and urban and rural town centre deals. I think there's a need for perhaps the committee might want to look at all of this in the one pot and begin to actually bring it together, because there is funding, and there is also within city deals, and there's also funding in some of the other UK Scottish Government town deals, urban deals, that if we can begin to coordinate that a little bit more stronger than we are doing right now, it might help in terms of supporting businesses in these particular areas. Because it's not, I think we need to look closely at the city deal applications that were made, and are they still relevant in the crisis we're in? And that's a question mark. Or whether in fact it needs to be tweeted or perhaps resubmitted to UK and Scottish Government. In terms of cause for business and how can we help support business, we've talked a lot about the job retention scheme and employment costs, which tend to be obviously the higher cost for business. But can we look a little bit more at the total cost of doing business here in Scotland? And by that I mean, and you'll hear it from me again, the issue about the non-domestic rates. It was the number one concern at the start of COVID, and it remains up amongst the top three. It's a massive cost to all businesses, in all sectors, even with the support from the Scottish Government in terms of rates relief. But we've had reviews, we've had recommendations. Can we just close that off and begin to perhaps focus on looking at reducing the cost of our business rates? Also looking quite closely at, it was mentioned about planning system. Yes, we've had some flexibility in planning, but it's still not good enough. Can we revisit that? Because the National Planning Framework is there. That's going to take time. Can we look at a short-term action plan, particularly on planning, that is going to make it easier for construction to get up and running quickly, for major projects to up and running very quickly across all parts of Scotland? And that's where this differentiation can be disadvantaged for many businesses, depending on the interpretation being implemented by local authorities and planning. And my final one is on procurement. And again, we've put in our briefing some suggestions as to how we could utilise the procurement opportunities better to support small and medium-sized business in particular. All of that as a package could go quite a way to helping to retain businesses and indeed jobs.
I know other panel members want to come in, but could I just say that what we're discussing here is not whether we're going to have a decline, but how steep and how sharp that decline is going to be. Do we have any feel for that? What is the impact going to be on our business base at the end of this fallout?
Right, I see Tracy, Barry and Helen want to come in. I'm looking at the time. Can we try and keep our answers fairly succinct? Otherwise, we're going to struggle to get through all the questions that members want to ask. So we'll go to Tracy first, please.
Hi. Yeah, I think, you know, if you look at the figures and the economic predictions, it looks, you know, dire, and it looks like this is going to not be a quick turnaround. This is going to have a long-lasting impact on the business community in Scotland for the next 2 to 3 years. I suppose the only thing, and we've debated this a lot internally, like we have a large number of family firms in Scotland, and when I talk to them, they've always had a fairly conservative, cautious approach. They've had 3 years of Brexit planning. So there are a number of firms in Scotland that have sat on cash. You know, they haven't borrowed, they haven't scaled up using alternative finance. So that, I think, is very hard sometimes to predict, is how much family firms can tighten the belt, if you like. You know, we hear of companies where, you know, it's a family on it and they won't pay themselves a salary for 3 months. Now, that's just something that economists can't really predict in. But I think those are more isolated cases rather than a general. But I think there is something about in Scotland that we do have, I say, these large number of very successful conservative family firms, and some of them do have cash that might see them through it. I think we've also got some sectors that we're very strong on that should weather the storm better than others. So our financial services, our creative sector, our digital sector, and of course our renewable sector has a really good future in it as well. So one of the things we're trying to look at, particularly with our manufacturing base, is if they're in automotive or aerospace, could they pivot into renewables? You know, if you're an engineer and you're sort of focused on turbines for airlines, could you focus on turbines for wind turbines, for example? So there are potential opportunities there that's hard to predict at the moment, but if companies can flex, they could see a way through this more successfully than perhaps the numbers on paper look like at the moment. I think the key thing we want to get across is a lot of the recovery work is focused on the mid to long term, and we think it's absolutely essential that we have a really urgent or a focus on that next 12 months. We need to have plans in place in the next few weeks, not months, on how we help people being made redundant, how we help support our youth who are made unemployed, on the green recovery, on business survival. So we need to split recovery into that long-term vision, which is important, but we really need urgent action. What is going to happen to support businesses in the next 6 to 12 months? So lots to welcome in the Scottish Government's response to the Benny Higgins response, but it was called an implementation plan, and at the moment there aren't any timelines in that plan for when that support's coming. I know we will hear more on that in the next few weeks, but our concern is we need that help now, not in the spring or autumn next year. Thank you.
Okay, Barry then, quickly.
No problem. So always difficult to summarise the concerns of a diverse business community, but you know, I'll try that using a survey that we just closed last week, and it provides a useful summary to address some of the issues that Colin raised. So we've got 53% are confident that they will survive. 31% have taken on more debt, but they think it's manageable. 25% are fundamentally changing their business model or planning to do so. 5% are likely to seek temporary employment until the business gets back on its feet, and 4% will likely permanently close their business and move into employment.
Well, that was succinct. Thank you, Barry. I think that gives Colin a fairly clear what businesses are saying. And Helen, then, very quickly, what do you think is going to happen?
I'll just very briefly build on Tracy's points then. I think Tracy talked very succinctly about the idea of flex and businesses moving into opportunities, particularly around the green economy. I think for us, we would say the important thing there is to build those opportunities for firms to do that through government procurement and government sourcing of contracts, and making sure that there are opportunities for British and UK firms to receive work in that, and that it provides employment here in the UK. We would also want to urge some caution on the idea that we throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of regulation or standards. I think it's really important that we do continue to have high aspiration for the sort of economy that we want to see, and I think building fair work outcomes in to the recovery is really important, and it could help us design an economy that has a much stronger sort of worker voice and much less in work poverty within it coming out the other side.
Thank you, Helen. I'll remind all the witnesses, I know some of you are using it already, that you can put any further comments you want in the chat box and they will be picked up. So that's really helpful. Thank you. Colin, are you happy if I move on?
I'm happy, yes.
Thank you. Can I go to Andy Whiteman then, please? Andy.
Thank you very much, Convener. Barry McCullough just mentioned a recent survey showing 31% of businesses have taken on more debt, and I believe that is sustainable. Fraser Valander was also looking at the question of businesses taking on debt, and I just wonder if panellists can give us an indication as to whether in fact the vast majority of that debt they think is sustainable and prudent, or whether there's any debt there that is born of rather desperate circumstances. Just briefly on that one. And then another question I have is about the whole question of some businesses that I've spoken to appear to regard their best prospects as going into some form of hibernation. In essence, they don't want to lose the assets and all the rest of it, but they want to hibernate. They don't think it's profitable to come back for the next 3 to 6 months. Have you heard anything about that from your members? And what would your views be on that? Thank you.
Okay, Barry, let's start with you. What are small businesses saying on that?
So as I just mentioned, so we've got 31% have taken on more debt or taken out debt for the first time. But pleasingly, many believe that level is manageable and sustainable. It's important to know, as Andy was illustrating, that debt in small businesses and high levels of indebtedness is a fairly new phenomenon, and policymakers for many decades they've been trying to encourage smaller businesses to take on more debt finance and more equity finance, and of course many are doing it now to get them through what we're experiencing just now. Without a doubt, they're doing this to try and bridge the period between whether it's April to September or September onwards. And if you look at the figures from the Bounce Back Loan Scheme or the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, the figures show that the scheme has had a huge impact. But I think just for us, we're unsure what impact servicing that debt will have in the longer term, and whether or not that will come in place of investing in the business, whether or not it will dampen the recovery when we get to, and whether or not it comes at the cost of doing other things that they would otherwise like to do, whether or not investing in their staff or training or upgrading their premises. But as Andy mentioned, and just to go over, this debt was taken out to get them through a very tricky spot. It was also taken out in the assumption, I think, that this crisis would be shorter and sharper. I think as we're seeing, that's not the case. So there's definitely an argument coming very soon about what other finance opportunities we can provide for businesses to get through the next 6 to 12 months.
Okay, thank you. Liz, that's the point, isn't it? You borrow money, it has to be paid back, whether you're a government or a business, and that curtails your other choices. So what are you hearing from the businesses you're dealing with where the debt level is concerned?
We're running out of time, so I agree with the majority of what Barry said there. Is it sustainable in the long term? No, it's not. In the majority of cases, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses, because they've taken debt up to a level that we're not used to managing. And if we cannot get out there and open our doors and get the income coming back in, we are not investing in our business at all. And that is a big challenge for the majority of small businesses. And in fact, the other question was around, and I'll move to that, this hibernation issue. We're absolutely right. There are businesses that have came to us across Scotland and said, it's just not viable for me to open the doors again. So I'm closing and will not return. I'll wait and see how the situation is in 3 months or 6 months. So that's not great for the economy, but for that particular business, and it's not great for the people they employ, for that particular business, it's actually costing them less to keep their business closed than it is to open it up, given the reductions in capacity and given the lack of consumer and business confidence out there. So that hibernation model, or a bit of both, is actually being implemented as we speak, and I rather suspect it will actually grow in the next 6 months.
Yeah, and then of course the challenge that's coming then is at what point do you let the economy run? Because I see New Zealand have now got an outbreak again after 102 days of saying it's fine. Andy, do you want to come back on any of that?
No, I'm happy to move on, Convener, in the interest of time.
Thank you very much. So in that case, can I go to Dean Lockhart, please? Dean.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to our panel. I would like to get the panel's views on the Scottish Government's response to the advisory group on economic recovery. I think we can all agree that we want to see at the end of this a well-being economy based on renewable resources, but I'd like to get the panel's views on whether there is enough detail and enough funding in the Scottish Government's response to make a real difference in terms of economic recovery.
Right, who'd like to respond to that? Any volunteers? Lots of thinking going on. Okay, Liz has put her hand up first, and then Helen. Liz.
Dean, and I'll be very brief. So, has it got enough detail in it in terms of the report? No, it hasn't. But it does have some strategic and medium to long-term priorities in it. But it doesn't have the detail and the timeline and the action plans yet. It is our hope and desire that that will come forward. Does it have enough funding in it? No. We would like to see. Now, funding is a sensitive issue with all governments. So we need to be quite clear that, at the end of the day, we don't have a finite pot of funds with either at UK level or indeed at Scottish level. So I think there's an exercise that should be looked at in terms of what are we using our funding for, and is it really targeted to helping support businesses in the way that business needs it. So I really do think that review should be carried out very quickly, so that we can look at what we're spending our money on and where are the gaps, and indeed if there are gaps in funding, is that an opportunity to look at private sector investment and stronger public-private sector partnerships, particularly around our infrastructure and our investment opportunities.
Okay, Helen, very quickly.
Yeah, our response to it was pretty clear that it just didn't have the level of stimulus within it that the economy needs. And part of that is about the fact that the stimulus at UK level was not at the level that the economy needs. I think we just need to be much more ambitious with the idea that we kickstart the economy, that we kickstart the Green New Deal, that we see things like raising social security, raising wages as a form of stimulus as well, and that we really try to get the economy moving again in that way and in the direction that we need to go anyway, because we need to make this transition to a low carbon economy. So we may as well marry these two crises together.
Thank you. And Tracy, you wanted to come in. Tracy.
Yeah. Most of it's been covered. I think, as I've said before, our key thing on the reports, we need to balance the need to invest in a long-term sustainable recovery. We're responding to the urgent challenges that companies are facing today, and I feel that is still missing from the Scottish Government's response. We also know that the UK Government and the Scottish Government are both going to be critical in Scotland's recovery. So we have to find a way, or they have to find a way, to work constructively together, for example, on the Kickstart scheme and, on infrastructure and green recovery. The two governments need to work together on that. And at the moment, it's not clear how that's going to happen.
Okay. And finally, Barry, I see you're trying to come in as well. Barry.
Yes, very briefly, Convener. So yes, the advisory group was not tasked with ensuring as many small businesses survive the crisis, or indeed asked to specifically focus on short-term measures. But as Tracy has mentioned a couple of times now, it's difficult to reconcile the aspirations of the implementation plan published last week and the harsh commercial realities facing small businesses at the moment, not least of which for those in new or existing lockdown restrictions.
Thank you, Barry. Dean, have you wanting to come back on any of that?
Yeah, I would actually, and thanks very much for those answers. It's a related question, and maybe put some bones around this, because the question is how these Scottish Government enterprise agencies should be spending their budgets. For example, the Scottish National Investment Bank has been allocated, I think, £500 million over the past 2 years. So my question is, what proportion of that money should be spent to help existing businesses which are viable survive COVID, as opposed to making the Scottish National Investment Bank making more speculative long-term investments, addressing some of the mission statements which might not actually help the economy during this crisis?
Barry, we'll start with you, Barry. We'll go the other way around.
Sure. I think that what the Scottish National Investment Bank does when it becomes operational is absolutely critical. We are on record supporting many of the mission statements, but now 5 months into the pandemic, we continue to argue that when the bank does get up and running, it has to supplement its core focus and consider introducing long-term and flexible recovery finance, because there is a concern that the bank is assuming that the private sector will be there and be able to partner and provide that finance. But with the data that we have at our disposal, it's just not an assumption that we necessarily share. So there's definitely a debate to be had about what the bank does in the next 6 to 9 months.
Anybody else want to come in on that? Helen. Go to Helen.
I think it's important that that the bank does continue primarily with its missions, particularly the sort of idea of patient finance, the idea of sustainability and moving to a low carbon economy. I think those are really, really crucial elements of this. That doesn't mean that it can't be supporting the economy that already exists. In fact, I do think that building from what we have is an important element of this. But there are companies out there that are struggling at present that could be supported to play a really key role in the economy. So, for example, Alexander Dennis is struggling, yet they are a world leader in green buses. There's absolutely no reason why we would ever lose that key strategic asset, and that's something that perhaps the Scottish National Investment Bank could look at. It might again mean that our manufacturing base needs to pivot, as Tracy said before, towards different outputs, and that might be true in different areas of the economy. But I do think we need to focus on this idea of long-term patient capital and of really focusing in on the green investment and the Green New Deal, because those are the things that have the longevity to see us through this crisis. And if we're too short-term focused, then we may simply end up putting good money after bad to companies that maybe don't unfortunately don't have the future that we thought that they had a few years ago. I think there are other actors in the economy, though, that should be providing that short-term finance. So I think seeing the Scottish National Investment Bank as something that is there to do what it was designed to do, rather than the person who shores up the economy in the short term, which I think should more come from government, from enterprise agencies, from local authorities, those sorts of actors. But we should be trying to build the type of economy that we want to see. And that really is, that needs to be the message, I think, going forward.
Thank you, Helen. Did anybody have anything that wanted to add to that? Oh, okay. Dean, are you complete?
Yep, that's great. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Can I go to Gordon MacDonald then, please?
Convener, in the interest of time, the points I wanted to raise have already been covered. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. In that case, I'll move to Rhoda Grant, please.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask the panel what are their views on the Scottish Government business support and fair work conditionality? Do business understand terminology? And how can it be audited? How can we see that businesses getting support are actually practicing fair work?
Who wants to go first on that? Rush to volunteer. Tracy, I'll pick on you then.
I think we should start from the position that, that fair work is a really positive story for Scotland to tell, and that there are actually great examples throughout the coronavirus where our firms going out of their way to support their staff, whether that was on furlough top-ups, family flexibility, mental health support. And the vast majority of firms are committed to the fair work principles, but we also can't escape the extreme challenges many of them are facing right now. And they basically are fighting to protect as many jobs and livelihoods as possible. So for us, we sort of feel that we need to be stressing the importance on focusing on employee engagement in managing the crisis, rather than presenting firms already at breaking point with a long list of specific practices all of them should adopt. For us, as I say, the clear focus has to be on the importance of genuine communication and collaboration between employers and employees. And we think that will be much more effective right now, as every business will be in a different situation. For example, we absolutely have to ask and expect our employers to offer an awful lot of flexibility to their staff, particularly those workers who are supporting care responsibility or family responsibilities. But at the same time, we have to be asking employees to show a degree of flexibility as well. I've talked about the constraints that manufacturing is under around social distancing. So we're needing employees to show flexibility, for example, on shift patterns. And we're actually seeing that. There are great examples across Scotland of employees are going who are, helping firms out fantastically in this way. So, fair work is very important, but I am worried that there is an awful lot of focus on what employers need to be doing. And really, we need to be focusing on how employers and employees can be working together during this crisis. Thank you.
Anybody else want to respond to that one? Helen. Go to Helen, please.
Yeah, I would actually agree with what Tracy has just said. I think the root of fair work is, and has always been, that employees and workers and employers really work together to solve issues for the company. That is fundamentally the core of the Fair Work approach. It's that idea of social partnership, it's that idea of social dialogue. And actually there's a huge amount that we can do in this crisis that is about building the building blocks more systematically into the economy to give space for workers and employers to really shape economic responses and challenges within companies together. And when faced with a challenge, in some ways you see the benefits of that Fair Work approach, because there are potentially things that companies can do when they get together with their workforce to meet that challenge that perhaps looks insurmountable before you have that conversation. And that can be about shift alteration, it can be about going to a 4-day week, it can be about, there are a whole range of things that employers and workers can kind of work through and come to arrangements on when presented at that. And if you do it in that way, you can actually find that your business is more innovative, it's stronger, it rides the crisis easier, you've got a much more committed workforce coming out the back end of it, and then you can start to look at skilling issues and those sorts of things as well. It gives you that method of communication. And, if one thing, and I think Tracy's right as well, like through this crisis, we've seen some really, really good examples of that way of working being built in to the response to the crisis through the sectoral guidance at a workplace level, through the sort of risk assessment process. And I think there is a lot that we can build on and should be building on. But I think the core here is really putting this way of working and this commitment into hardwired sort of into the response, which is why we do think Fair Work conditionality around government funding helps focus the mind and helps focus the sort of approach and helps everybody get together and understand this is a positive way to work going forward. But it doesn't necessarily have to be the challenge to business that I think some employers worry that it might be. Actually, it can be a really, really positive way of working that actually makes a contribution to weathering the storm.
Thank you. Rhoda, did you want to come back on?
Can I come back on just a different issue? I know we're short of time and I would have liked to explore that further, but just because of time, can I maybe just ask the panel about their thoughts on economic and business support and the infrastructure in Scotland and how it's responded to COVID-19? And is it fit for purpose? Have people been working together, or are there issues we need to deal with?
Okay, Liz, I see you had your hand up, so I'll come to you first on that. Liz.
Yeah, it was on the previous question, but never mind. I think that I agree with everything Helen and Tracy said, but I think we're actually starting off the premise that businesses were not operating under Fair Work principles. And my experience has been that the majority of businesses in Scotland pre-COVID and during COVID were already on that agenda. Not all of them, and I accept we've got a message to get out there, but the majority of businesses actually acknowledge already that to look after our people is fundamentally part of how we run our businesses, because it will advocate all the productive outputs that Helen indicated. Your question, Rona, it's a big one in less than 2 minutes, or whatever, economic business support. There have been during COVID, there's no doubt about it, the Scottish Government have put in place a lot and a variety of business support mechanisms. Resilience Fund, the other Scottish Government, particularly sectoral funds, they've all been welcomed. But in terms of the wider business support, I think moving forward, rather than have we done it all right historically, I think moving forward we should be looking quite closely at what all of the agencies, economic agencies, are going to be doing quite clearly, and working in a more collaborative fashion with agencies. For instance, you've got Skills Development Scotland, Highlands and Islands, you've got Scottish Enterprise, you've got Funding Council. I'd like to see them not just collaborating, but stopping and looking closely at how they're going to restructure potentially, and how they're going to identify what the key business support mechanisms need to be the next 3 to 6 months, because there have been gaps, and they've got enough intelligence that they're aware of that. So I would like to see that revisited, but Now is not the time for major restructuring, given COVID, given Brexit, but somewhere someone needs to stop and evaluate and monitor on a regular basis whatever their agencies are delivering. Is it working for business? And I'm talking about on a month-to-month basis. So that if it's not working for business, it's not meeting what business needs, then it needs to be redirected immediately, rather than just wait and continue to do more support that's not required by business.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Can I go to Barry, please? Barry.
Thank you. The collective effort from the Scottish and UK governments, local authorities and public agencies has provided lifeline support for eligible small businesses during the lockdown. I mean, that is unquestionable that this support has prevented mass business closures and redundancy. That's not to say that the support was perfect. There were lots of implementation problems, lots of teething issues, and to this day there are gaps in this support. But overall, the support's played a huge part in repairing business confidence. But I think as we look ahead, it's clear that despite the hard work that has gone into supporting businesses and despite all the work going into the Higgins Review and the government's response, a gap is evident in policy terms. And it's about, as we've mentioned before, how are we going to support struggling businesses, some of which are in survival mode, on the here and the now? How do they make it not to the end of the year, but how do they make it to September and October? And I think in that context, the debate is going to have to shift to how we provide financial support for businesses that are hit by local lockdown restrictions, as they currently are in Aberdeen, as well as how do we support the firms that will be closed as a result of Test and Protect. So we see this shift coming in business support that will have to move quite quickly. Otherwise, we are quite fearful about what impact the next 6 months will have on small businesses.
Yeah, and as Liz is indicating, a lot of these businesses can't be saved. It's not a question of woe. They can't be because maybe their supply chain's gone, their customers have disappeared or moved away, are not spending. So some of those challenges are beyond actually what a government can do to solve it. I see Dean wants to come back in. Dean.
Thanks. Very quickly for Barry. But Barry, there are, as you know, a number of outstanding applications from business for business support across all local authorities. What's the main reason for these applications being outstanding?
I think as we are led to believe, and we had a quick look at the data that was published last week on the Pivotal funds and the Creative Hospitality and Tourism and funds, as well as the B&B schemes. And I think our understanding is that local authorities have different processes and different ways in which they approach this scheme. Some have done very well and got their money out quickly and interpreted the guidance flexibly and got the money to where it needs to go. And others have been much more closer to the guidance that was issued. And I think that you've got a situation which is, to be honest, completely unacceptable. That lots of local businesses are still waiting for further support funds. But I think we're now at this point where the scheme is closed. We need to evaluate the impact that these schemes have had. We need to establish what the levels of underspend are, and then we need to allocate whatever underspend is left to other business support packages. And as I mentioned before, foremost in our thoughts is providing support to those who will face new lockdown restrictions.
Thank you.
Before we wind up this session, I just wanted to explore very quickly with you the impact on young people. I mean, there is certainly no doubt in my mind, and when I look at the stats across the board and what is happening around the whole management of COVID now, young people are going to pay the price. So not only are we going to see sharp rises in unemployment in young people, we're predicting significant impacts on their long-term futures, but they're also going to be picking up the bill for all the support that has been put in place. And I just wanted to hear from each of you, if you can, fairly succinctly, what you think we ought to be doing in terms of young people. Have we learnt anything from the last recession, where we saw, I think it took 7 years for unemployment amongst young people to recover? Did we learn anything from that? And I suppose the big question that I'm certainly being asked and that I'm hearing mooted is, young people are the least impacted by COVID as an illness. Are the health steps we're taking actually the right ones for our young generation, or should we be allowing them to get on with working and allow them to drive their futures? Are they paying a very, very big price for this in terms of the economy? So can I ask each of you in turn, just very quickly, to comment on the future for our young people? Who wants to go first? Right, I'll pick on Helen then as the youngest. Helen.
I appreciate that you've identified me as the youngest. I'm not sure that's true, but I think this is such a key issue, and we do know from previous recessions that young people are very negatively impacted. Their employment is impacted in the short term, but actually their long-term earnings potential is also impacted, which has a whole knock-on impact throughout their career. I think for us, we would be keen that there is real targeted support put in here. So I think, both governments have done the right thing in that they have developed a jobs guarantee scheme for young people. We would make a very strong plea that that is paid at the living wage and at the very minimum, the adult rate of the minimum wage, but ideally the living wage. We do think that the youth differentials within the minimum wage are just unjustifiable and do not represent the living costs that young people do have. I also think we need to think about housing, because housing is a source of real issue for young people. Thinking about rent controls is also a way of ensuring that young people can livelihoods can sort of continue and have the money to kind of live on. I think that could be built into some of the infrastructure development plans that we have if we think quite holistically about those issues. I think we also do need to think about apprenticeships and the provision of apprenticeships between companies. And again, it might be an opportunity to think flexibly about how those are provided maybe between companies. But once again, would say let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and let's keep the high level of apprenticeship design and provision that we have here in Scotland. We don't want to see a diminution in the skills that young people are fundamentally being given through these programmes. So I think there are quite a lot of challenges here, but it is absolutely essential that we get this right, because it does have such a scarring impact on young people going forward. And if I can just very quickly touch on your last question, which was about young people's health impacts around COVID. I would be nervous about that as an approach, because while young people might not be impacted as severely as older people, they don't live in a bubble. They do live in the community, and we know that community transmission does happen asymptomatically. So, and from people who are not severely impacted from the disease. So I think what we're trying to do here is suppress the disease, is to make sure that it doesn't spread as much as possible. And that actually does require everyone to play their role, including those who are less severely impacted. And I think it's also important to recognise that young people can have underlying health conditions too, and it's not right to set an expectation that they will be fine, because that isn't necessarily the case. And it's not right to ask a young person to risk their life to work in this idea that they are safe when they may not be in reality. So I do think there are some very, very real challenges here. I think there's some challenges around how education is delivered as well within colleges and universities. And I think it's important that we continue to prioritise a high level of skills output for young people. But I would also echo Tracy's point from earlier that our upskilling agenda cannot simply be about the under 25 age group, that it does have to go across the workforce as well, but that we do need to keep a good focus on the provision of skills for young people too.
Thank you. Tracy, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think Helen actually just sort of covered it off there, but I think actually both the UK government and Scottish government have and seem to be putting, a lot of mechanisms in place to support young people, which we fully support, whether that's around, the Kickstart scheme. Also we've asked for as well, expanding the Transition Training Fund, the Flexible Workforce Development Fund. We've talked about introducing a temporary wage subsidy to support employers to retain their apprenticeships. All these things are absolutely critical, but it can't be at the expense of older employees as well. We know that particularly those over 50 can be susceptible to redundancy as well, and the reality is we're expecting people to be working into their 60s, even up to 70, so they've got 20 years in front of them. So we must make sure it's not an either or, that we are doing as much for people at whatever stage of life they're in that they face redundancy. Of course, generally the older they are, the more financial responsibilities you will probably have, whether that's in the form of mortgages or you've got childcare costs, etc. But I think, absolutely critical that we focus on young people, but not at the expense of sort of older workers as well. And on the point about sort of, I suppose it depends on what age group. I think it's absolutely essential, as I said before, that young people are back in school today. But actually, if you talk about people in their 20s and 30s, I was told by the Scottish Government yesterday, actually, they're the biggest percentage of people with new cases of coronavirus in Scotland in the last month or so. So I think the message still has to be very clear to everybody, whether you're 20 or you're 50, that coronavirus is still here and we all have a responsibility of making sure we don't spread the virus. So I don't think I would go as far as sort of saying that young people should be completely allowed to be sort of set free and sort of live their lives. They are very much a part of the community and need to be, taking their role of, seriously too. So I think that's my two key points. Thank you.
Okay, and finally, Barry, you get the last word today then on this panel.
So I began my career in 2008, so I know what it's like to find work in an economic downturn, and I'm fortunate I was a graduate. But have we learned the lessons from the previous recession in policy terms? I think we've learned some lessons, and you see this with the strong focus on avoiding a lost generation of young people in the Scottish Government's response to Higgins. However, we do have concerns that we are not taking the time to reflect on the deficiencies inherent in the implementation of developing the young workforce. We are at the risk of making the same mistakes where we think we are devising schemes that will work for small businesses when in reality we are not. And I think there's such a rush to respond to this situation, which is completely understandable, but we do need to make sure that these schemes don't just work for corporate businesses in the city centre of Edinburgh and Glasgow.
Thank you very much, Barry. And can I thank all of our panel members today? I think that's been useful. And so that's Tracy, Barry, Helen and Liz. Thank you for your time, and no doubt we'll see you again. We'll now have a brief suspension, so we'll just take a couple of minutes before we move to our next panel. Thank you. Okay, and I'd like to welcome you back to the committee, and we're going to move to our second panel of witnesses, where we're going to focus on the impact of COVID-19 on young people and their employment. So I'd like to welcome Professor David Blanchflower, Russell Gunston, Director, IPPR Scotland, and Mary Spowage, Deputy Director of the Fraser Vallender Institute. So my particular thanks go to Professor Blanchflower, because I believe you are joining us from America today, where it's still rather early in the morning, I say the middle of the night. So thank you very much for taking the time out of your bed to come and join us. So we'll do the same as before, and I'll move to questions from members, and I'd like to start, please, with Rhoda Grant. Rhoda.
Thank you, Convener. And following on almost from the end of the last panel, can I ask how the Scottish Employment Support and new social security powers can be used to help young people and indeed women secure decent jobs? Those are the two categories that are most badly affected by job losses during the pandemic.
Right, who'd like to go first? Russell, you're looking like you're ready to answer a question. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you ever so much for having me here today. Yes, so the new powers, in some respects, the pandemic has come a little bit early for the new powers to really kick in to help around social security. So the Scottish Child Payment, one of the key interventions, was due to kick in towards the end of this year, and now been delayed by some time, yet to be defined because of the pandemic. And that would have been a very, very useful way of getting additional funding to families who needed it, low-income families, during this time. So because that's not available, what we've seen is that the Scottish Government has run a lot of the additional support either through existing payments, such as the carers allowance supplement, or through the local level, for example, through the free school meals payment, and through the wellbeing or welfare funds. So on social security, that's what we've seen. I think as we move into this next part of the crisis, want to see far more in this territory. And as you've heard from some of the business representatives in the previous panel, that can't wait till spring. That has to be as soon as possible. In terms of jobs, I think it's less social security and more around some of the things you've seen through the advisory board on economic recovery and the government's response to it. We've pushed very hard for a jobs guarantee scheme in Scotland, really welcome the UK-wide Kickstarter one, and await detail on the job scheme in Scotland that will come. But there's more beyond that. We need to get people back to work, but crucially the focus has to be not just any job. We can't go back to an any job strategy. We must maintain our laser focus on the long term. And that to me is around career progression, it's around job quality. So any of these schemes, any of these interventions can't just be about people sort of treading water. We must see career progression built in and flexibility built in. So that not just young people, but all of the people likely to be shed, all of the groups likely to be shed from the labour market are able to access the help that they need.
Thank you, Russell. Mary, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so as Russell said, obviously the range of social security powers that the Scottish Government was due to take on, the main one that's of relevance here is the new Scottish Child Payment, which has been delayed, which is unfortunate, because that could have gone a long way to helping families during the crisis. So the existing mechanisms have been used, and a lot more money has gone through local authorities and the welfare funds to target particular families in need. But the key area that young people can be helped through is in looking at jobs and skills. And as Russell said, I would agree with what he said, because we can't just focus on any job or getting them into employment without thinking about the wider skills that they're going to develop, because young people obviously can be scarred in the long term by suffering unemployment, but they can also be scarred by being in a job which doesn't utilise all their skills. And if they're in a period of low skilled employment for a long time, that can have impacts on their employment prospects for many years to come. in the future. So while these the job guarantee schemes that the governments, both the UK and Scottish governments, have announced are welcome, we're sort of yet to see exactly all of the details of those and how they might work together to ensure that all young people are helped and people don't fall through the gaps.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Professor Blackflower, do you want to come in on that?
I'm obviously not a great expert on what Scotland's been doing, but in a sense, I think the conversations the other two people just said now and the conversation from the previous panel hasn't really quite got the fact that we're in, an absolute crisis for the young, because if you think of people who are furloughed, who's going to get hired next time around? Answer: the people who are furloughed. We have a bunch of 16-year-olds just leaving school now, and this looks like a disaster. I think the big and the sensible thing people said is, particularly, you need to do something about it now. But I think also relevant to the members of the committee, I sent around a little PowerPoint that I did earlier in the week, and I just want to sort of encourage people to just think about this. That actually we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We've done huge amounts of work on this. All the great labour economists in the world have worked on it, and we know what happens, and we know what the consequences are. So the consequences of young people not being able to get a foothold into the labour market are long and long-lasting. The way to think of it is this generates permanent scars, not temporary blemishes. And if there's one group we need to focus on right now, it's the young, and I want people to have in their heads 16-year-olds. The 16-year-olds who just left a high school or left a school in Glasgow, what are they doing? And I think one thing you ought to have in your mind as well is that some of the things we're seeing in America, Chicago yesterday, Portland and elsewhere, what we're starting to see is unrest on the streets. Why? Well, a lot of it has to do with young people. The surprise in the past has been that the young have been compliant. So I think this is an absolute emergency, an absolute crisis, and we should be trying to think about what we could do in the early part of September. And a lot of people have been trying to think about this, and we had a big meeting this week at the Royal Economic Society, and Anton Muscatelli and I have been trying to think about what we could do. And one of the big things we could actually do is universities can play a big role in this. If you think, okay, Chinese students aren't coming, the worry is that the numbers of students are not coming. Well, Anton's view and other presidents of universities suggest that actually the universities could do something. Just think, there's no students coming to them. They potentially could step in here, and we should talk about that. Anton's view is we are well placed to do it. Somebody's got to fund this. But if you think you don't need to set up a new bureaucracy, you have it sitting there ready. But my view is that if I wave a flag, the flag we must wave is that if we don't do something about the young, we're going to be in big trouble. But we don't need to do lots of research. We know the answers. And the answers are we need to do locally targeted things for the young. And if we don't, the consequences are going to be enormous. So I'm waving my flag, but I've worked on this for 30 years and we know the answer. Time to do something is now. Universities are probably the place who can help the most, but let's go do something is my response.
Yeah.
Get people going.
Rhoda, do you want to come back on that?
Yes, could I? What is that something we should be doing, I guess, is the bottom line. To hear some of the ideas that we should be putting in place or urging government to put in place straight away to help young people.
Yeah. So I'll come back to you, Professor. Yeah, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. But we do have examples. So David Bell and I wrote a column in The Guardian the other day, and we talked about the evidence we've actually seen from the 30s was the Civilian Conservation Corps, which actually hired very large numbers of people. They actually went around planting trees, but this can be sort of coordinated with a green program. One of the things, just for people to understand, one of the great outcomes it turned out, take these people out of unemployment, put them into worthwhile activity, and it turns out that it had very positive effects, not least actually people's height rose. So actually people who went on the conservation program in the United States, they planted millions of trees, but the impact was that they grew taller compared to other people. So I think that this idea that we can do green things, we can step in a sense, the answer is if you don't, the consequences will be dire.
I see Russell Gerson wants to come in. Russell.
Yeah, and I'd very much agree with Professor Blanchflower around the urgency, the level of the crisis, the level of the scarring, not just in the short, but over the long term that could happen if we don't get this right. And the need to act, as I said, as soon as possible, not waiting till the next financial year, for example. The types of things, the types of scale we're looking at, you're talking about hundreds of thousands into the six figures of young people unemployed if the central projections for unemployment more broadly are correct. So 100,000, keep that figure as well as that 16-year-old in your head. How do we get opportunities for around 100,000 young people in Scotland? And universities, I think, so indirectly, government can fund increases in university places. I think college places deserve a mention. Apprenticeships are absolutely crucial, but going to be very, very difficult to maintain. But all three of those are absolutely part of the mix. Job schemes, again, directly can be funded. We talked about that. And Danny's right, there are big learning from past interventions around 10 years ago. And then the last one, and I'm sure we'll get to it, but more broadly, is fiscal stimulus and directing government funding into the economy in a way that boosts the economy. That's difficult for the Scottish Government to do in any great scale through the existing powers, but we hope, and I think the Chancellor signalled, that in the November budget, there'll be more to say on that from the UK Government. That needs to be of a scale to match the scale of the crisis that we're in, not just on youth unemployment, but more broadly across the economy.
Thank you, Russell. And thank you, Rhoda. So I'm going to move to Alison Harris now. Alison.
Convener, thank you. I really think my question has been covered quite considerably, so I'm happy just to move on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alison. In that case, I'll move to Richard Lyle, please. Richard.
Thank you, Convener. Professor Blanchflower, you wrote in June in a Certain Scot blog about the recent increase in youth unemployment coming on top of a secular decline in the prospect of the young. By this, you must have been referring to a lowering of living standards compared to those enjoyed by their parents, more precarious employment, as well as higher costs related to higher education compared to those faced by previous generations. Can I explore with you your statement that the recent rise in youth unemployment comes on top of a secular decline in the prospects of the young, please? And that's to Professor Blanchflower.
Yes, thank you. So I sent some little charts around. I mean, a couple of things. Prior to COVID, we actually saw starting to see a deterioration already in the employment prospects of the young. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we also should focus on what I call the double whammy. So the problem has been about making the transition from school to work and entering the job pyramid. Think about a job pyramid. You enter it normally at a particular place. Graduates enter here, but there's been issues that they enter much lower. But one of the big things has actually been, and we should talk more, I think, about this, about underemployment. So if you think of the things that were talked about in the last panel, if firms are only at 30% capacity, or people are on 1 or 2 days a week, it means that their hours are less than they would like to be, and their incomes are less. But one of the big things David Bell and I have written a lot about is that the double whammy is that, youth unemployment rates tend to be relatively high, but what's happened is the young people enter lower down the job pyramids than they traditionally should. But the double whammy is that they don't get as good a job as they would like, and they don't get enough hours. So the implications of that are income is lower, and the ability to step out on your own becomes much less. So if you look at things like the ability to form your own household, to go somewhere else, that's really impacted. And one of the big things we saw, so if you take someone like a 28-year-old, look in the past, what proportion of 28-year-olds were living with mum and dad? And the answer is that's risen. So we've not seen people striking out on their own. And now what happens when the crisis comes, we know that actually the people who do best in the boom do worst in the slump. But the problem is during the boom, and your very well said question, the problem is during the boom, they didn't actually do that well. So they did okay. But now they're not in a very good position coming forward. So that includes graduates coming out of university, but especially inner city youth, minorities, and so on. So I think the consequences of what you have said are extremely serious. I mean, I don't think I could say to you as a Labour economist with lights flashing red that I have ever seen really in my lifetime, lights flashing more red than this for the young. If this is not a wake-up call, I don't know what is. But we have a little opportunity, we have a little time, but if you thought it was, if we look in the last recession and said that that might have been bad, this is going to be incomparably worse.
No one can dispute that COVID-19 has been a game changer. People may be staying at home because of house prices. So what do you think we should do to try and tackle this?
Well, I think we should throw the kitchen sink and everything we have at it. I mean, you know, the kitchen sink and maybe the kitchen. I mean, I think what we have to start to, I mean, my view would be, let's start, the first priority has to be the kids who are coming out of a Glasgow high school, who are coming in Edinburgh. Those kids, if this committee is not thinking, what are we going to do about these 16-year-olds who came out of school, what are they going to be doing? They've traditionally been a big problem. So my view would be, we focus on them, we try and think about programs for them. If it means you go to Anton Muscatelli and you say, go and take 10,000 kids in. Maybe you even take every single person who applied to a Scottish university. Forget about the grades. Take everybody. Just take everybody. This is going to need money, but the payback and the rate of return to that will be huge. And then go to the earlier point. Fiscal stimulus is obviously a big idea, but I hope that I can also say something else to you. I mean, I was on the MPC. It's not just fiscal policy, it's monetary policy too. But this is the occasion where you have to act first. And if anybody tells you we know where we're going, they don't, because it depends on lots of things. But your mistake would be to do too little and not to do too much. So thank you for your questions. I think you're spot on.
Yeah, if the convener allows me, just quickly.
Richard, before you continue, I know Russell and Mary both want to come in to add some comments to that. So maybe we'll hear what you've got to say first.
Come back at the end. If there's time at the end. Thank you.
Okay, Russell, we'll go to you.
Yeah, just very briefly, to back up the kitchen sink or the kitchen analogy, I think absolutely, you know, you have to act quickly. And I've mentioned some of the things you can do around that. So increasing college places, increasing apprenticeship places, if we can even maintain numbers, and increasing university places have a place to go. And trying to get up to that scale that we're talking about. How do you get 100,000 opportunities for young people in Scotland over these this next quarter? So absolutely just back up what's been said.
Thank you, Russell. Mary.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you know, we were talking a little bit there about the place of young people come into the crisis. And I guess this crisis has particularly impacted young people, as many crises do, but this has particularly been bad because of the impact on the sectors that have been worse affected, particularly in tourism and hospitality, which in terms of the age of the people they employ are much more likely to employ young people. And also they're much more likely to employ people in rural areas of the country and be one of the major employers of young people. So as well as thinking about those kids in Glasgow and Edinburgh, you know, there's about the opportunities that exist across the country for young people who would typically have been employed in tourism and hospitality in a rural area where that maybe is one of the main employers. So that's one of the reasons that this crisis has hit young people particularly hard, and the scarring effects, you know, as Professor Blanchflower has said, the lights are really flashing red for young people here. And I think what's required is a whole package of measures. Obviously, universities are part of the answer in terms of perhaps more funding for looking at more places that are available to Scottish students. But there has to be a package of measures here for businesses offering employment opportunities, apprenticeships, as Russell says, to maintain those. I think it will be challenging to maintain the current level of apprenticeship given business priorities right now, and that's quite serious. And we can't forget about college places as well. So there does have to be that whole package of measures for young people at different stages of their life to ensure that they can progress and not experience these long-term scarring effects that would be so damaging for our economy.
Absolutely. Richard, have you got a very specific point, or are you happy to come in at the end if we've got time?
Well, just to come back into the whole panel, we actually have more apprenticeships in Scotland than what we've ever had, but I think we need more fiscal autonomy in order to throw the kitchen. I agree with throwing the kitchen sink at this. No one should be left behind. Everyone should be helped. And actually, in the 80s, we had a work programme for the young when I was a councillor, which may have to be reintroduced.
Richard, I'm going to move on then because we haven't got much time for questions. So, Willie, can I go to you next? Willie Coffey, please.
Thanks very much, Convener. Do you think that governments, the UK, Scottish governments, indeed governments across the world, are really thinking big enough and fast enough to try to solve this? And do we really think that a furlough scheme or even extending a furlough scheme is going to solve this? I mean, I don't think so. So what are the kind of bigger things that we need to do as governments? Do we need to borrow much more over the future, the next few years, to try to fund some of this? Do we need to be thinking more about income tax? Is there a solution there? Do we need to be thinking about pension age, because people are working longer and retaining their jobs longer because they have to survive in the economy? But some of these bigger issues, should the governments be sitting down thinking about some of these and how these can help to get our young people into work and to stay there?
Who wants to go first on that one? The big picture. Mary, what's IPPR's thoughts on that?
Do you want Mary or do you want IPPR? Sorry.
Sorry, wrong way round. Sorry, Mary. Yes, sorry, your thoughts. Fraser Ballander, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, those are a lot of very big questions, and you've touched on a lot of the major challenges facing us that were facing us before the crisis of our ageing population, our shrinking working age population, and how we sort of support the older people in our society with a smaller workforce in the future. These are many of the challenges that we had before, which are likely to be exacerbated by the current crisis. In terms of the furlough scheme and its extension, obviously the Chancellor has made clear that it's not going to be extended past October, and that the key thing now is not to keep people attached to employers where there's unlikely to be a job for them in the future, and that we need to move on to policies which help people perhaps move into new industries, get reskilled, and so on, to sort of introduce the dynamism in the economy that we might need in order to recover sort of more in a more agile way. So I think that there might be a case for wage support and helping people between different jobs, definitely for training and upskilling to ensure that they're able to participate in different jobs. These are all things that can be looked at in order to introduce that sort of dynamism into the labour market again. But we do have a really big crisis here, and there will be a key role for government in spending money on this to keep the economy going until we're in a better place to recover.
Correct way round now. Russell, what's IPPR's view?
Thank you. I won't try to give you Fraser Ballander's view, I promise. But in many ways, it does overlap. I think so. At the broadest level, yes, we're going to have to borrow more. We shouldn't repeat the same mistakes that, in our view, we made following the crash, which was to withdraw support for the economy too early. I heard in the previous panel that absolutely there are costs to borrowing, but sometimes and often there are bigger costs to not borrowing, from underinvestment, from damage to your economy, to the people in your economy. And we're at that point. We need to be borrowing more than we have, even more than we have, despite such large numbers over this next period of time, to sustain demand in the economy so that there are opportunities not just within the skills and education system but out there beyond. And ideally in a way that addresses the challenges that was already facing Scotland prior to COVID, to automation, Brexit, climate change, ageing, economic inequalities. We had good words and good priorities around all of those things into the crisis. Rather than pausing them and coming back to them when the crisis is over, actually we need to double down on them through this. And I think, so wage support is an interesting idea. I think furlough, whilst incredibly important and incredibly welcome up to now, and for some sectors and for some local areas in lockdown beyond now, we may need to see something. Other things can come into play over the longer term, like short time working. I think in the last panel you heard about the French government being there lasting to the end of 2022. That may be a little more helpful to young workers than furlough, because after all, furlough may protect people's incomes, it may protect their job to go back to, but all the while furlough exists, people's skills will be diminishing. So even for them, we don't want people to be on furlough for a long, long time, albeit that is better than the alternative up to now. So yeah, I think at the broadest level, it's about borrowing more, not withdrawing support too soon, because actually you may cost yourself more money over the long term than doing so now.
Thank you, Russell.
I think I mean, your point is well taken. Can I give you two perspectives on it? The first perspective, sitting at the Bank of England in 2008, in some sense, the discussion, if you think about, you do quantitative easing, you try to do stimulus. The conversation which might help you was that we would try and think in our minds, how big is the drop in output that's coming? So in some sense, the calculation in your head is, okay, there's this drop in output that's coming, and you want to try and replace that with stimulus so that you can get back to where you were. And I think that's a good thing to have in your head. But I think what's fundamentally different today than was true in 2008 is that it seems very likely that there will be long-term change in people's behavior. So that makes it very hard to understand what's going on. What do I mean? Well, I'm a professor at Dartmouth. Well, Dartmouth is basically closed. We're going to teach classes. I haven't been to the university since, I can't even remember when. I'm going to teach class in the fall, and I'm not going to class. Some of the kids are coming. I'm going to teach from my house, the students 4 miles down the road, and I'm not going there. And the question is, am I not going to go back to the university, and I'm not going to get on a plane again? Am I not going to go to a shopping mall? Am I not going to go to get on a cruise ship? So the problem, in a sense, is the furlough scheme buys us time. But if there's a long-term change in behaviour, I mean, think of the members of the committee. Have you changed what you're fundamentally doing? And the answer is probably you have. So the difficulty for us is knowing, being able to say, yeah, we'll just take this nice V-shaped recovery. The more you and other people are changing your behaviour, the slower that recovery will be, and the greater the consequence to the Chancellor of removing that stimulus. It assumes that there are no permanent and long-run changes in behaviour, and if there are, then that will be more disastrous, and that will mean that probably, I call it the reverse square root recovery. So think of the square root sign, you just turn it round, and you go down and you come up, and then you stop. And that's the danger, and that's sort of what we're seeing in the United States. In a pickup, seeing COVID coming back, and then everything is turned back round again. So I think your question is very well taken, but I think the difference to anything we've ever seen since 1930 this is different because the potential is people have changed their spending patterns, they've changed their behaviour, and if they're changing their spending and spending less, that's a big output drop. So anything that errs on the side of caution is in error. We should be literally, I said, throw the kitchen at it. And in a sense, the Bank of England is trying to do that. And the problem for the Chancellor is the Bank of England hasn't got that many weapons that we had in 2008, and it can't make up enough. So my risks are all to the downside.
And can I ask for a clarification then on that, Professor Blanchard? Because if you anticipate that people have fundamentally changed their behaviour? So they're not going to spend, they're not going to go out in the way they did, and you borrow to support those businesses on the basis of survival, then they're not going to survive, because as and when you stop the support, if people have changed their behaviours, so you've borrowed a lot of money that's then got to be paid back, keep something going that you can't keep going. So how does that equation sit?
No, I think that's very good reason. But supposing I said this to you, Scotland is at war. Okay, so what would we do? Well, we wouldn't say, well, we can't defend our beautiful shoreline. We have to throw up the white flag because we haven't got the money to do it. Well, we would invest to save and to save ourselves. So in these special circumstances, I think you think of it as a war and you defend yourself and you kind of keep going. And yes, you're right to say, you probably want to, you have to pay it back. But if it was a war, you wouldn't say, well, we can't fund it. We can't. I mean, what happened in a war? Well, people took their pots and pans and melted them down. There were savings bonds. People lowered their standards of living and protected themselves. So I think the reasoning, I mean, your reasoning is perfectly sensible in normal times, right? But if it's in a wartime, I mean, maybe we should think of it as this. Your survival is the most important thing, and then you have to deal with it down the road. I mean, you buy yourself time for a vaccine. You buy yourself time for immunity. So I do think it's extending things longer, but our reasoning has to be different. I mean, go back to 2008 as a central banker. Nobody would have ever thought that we would have rates cut to zero. We'd have quantitative easing. We have negative rates in places around the world, and central banks would be buying ETFs, and the Bank of England would be buying American corporates. So I think that the thing I'm trying to say is that in these times we have to think in ways we haven't thought before. Your reasoning was completely sensible, but I think we're out of the sensible. I mean, completely sensible what you said, but you defend yourself.
Yeah, I mean, this is about challenging all ideas and trying to ensure that we understand why we're doing what we're doing. So,
absolutely.
Thank you for that.
I understood that, of course.
Right, I'm going to move to my colleague, Colin Beattie. Colin, please.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to sort of broaden this a little bit. Scotland's not tackling this on its own, nor is the UK. It's a worldwide problem. Countries around the world are responding to the present crisis and addressing their labour market challenges in a variety of different ways, particularly those faced by young people. What can Scotland learn from what's happening elsewhere? Where should we be taking best practice from, and what should we be avoiding? Any volunteers?
Right, okay. Russell, would you like to start on that one?
Yeah, sure, thank you. And I think, so again, almost the same pattern of response to some of the other questions. In the broadest sense, there are other countries that are investing much more and borrowing much more even than we are across the whole of the UK. The big numbers, as it seems, across the UK are being dwarfed by other countries across the world at this point, and we need to address that quickly. So I think that would be your first step. What do we need to do? What can we learn from elsewhere? Well, we probably haven't got the scale of the response yet right across the UK. Elsewhere, I mentioned the French short-time working scheme. It's more focused on the labour market as a whole rather than a focus on young people within the labour market. But it is a much more suitable intervention on an ongoing basis, as opposed to potentially the furlough scheme, which, again, with the exception of local lockdowns and some sectors, you want to be shorter term. It may be that we need to extend it for a bit, but not forever, not indefinitely. So in a way, the short-time working scheme is about how do you spread work around everyone rather than knock a portion of your labour or people in your labour out for a short period of time. That subsidises up to 40% of people's hours if they're working on shorter hours than their contract. So I think that's an interesting innovation. And then beyond that, you've got some things that were in place already in other countries. So you've got, again, a different focus within the skills system, even within the UK, never mind across the world. And we've already covered, I won't repeat, but we absolutely need to expand that in a way to delay people's exit from education and skills into the labour market, whilst also skilling them up for whenever the labour market comes back. So those broads, again, sort of echoing the pattern of previous responses, but have we got the scale of the overall response right? Are there individual sort of labour market schemes we can look at? And then some of those targeted skills and labour market interventions that we've mentioned just now and before.
Okay. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Mary?
Just to add, I would agree with everything Russell just said. Obviously, in some other countries, as well as the schemes that have been introduced during the crisis, there's existing schemes which are quite different to the setup in the UK, such as protection of wages through periods of unemployment that some Scandinavian countries have. But we have to remember, I suppose, that those countries are very different from the UK in terms of the level of taxation. So there's a higher level of public spend, but there's also a higher level of taxation than we're used to in this country. So whilst the job retention scheme was a necessary and welcome emergency measure, it does look like some of these other schemes that were already existing in these other countries. Whether those could be introduced in the UK, obviously, is they would be expensive and quite transformational in terms of our labour market and how it works. But those were already in existence and could potentially help people transition between different careers.
Okay. Thank you, Mary. Professor Blanchard, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I thought both those contributions were excellent. And the one thing I would argue you want to avoid is what's happened where I live. We actually now, I think I said in a chart I sent you, we're certainly seeing black youth unemployment now reaching levels, again, that we haven't seen in 50 years. 30–40% rates right now, not irrelevant that black youth unemployment rate is coming at a time where we're seeing social unrest around in the streets of America. And the other thing you're going to see is what happens from around now as the fiscal stimulus helping people who are unemployed. I mean, there's 30 million people in the US who are unemployed on benefits, and those benefits this last couple of weeks have been cut by $600 a week. And so we're going to see, an explosion of unemployment. We've seen an explosion of people trying to get to food banks. So America is precisely, the idea of looking at the French and looking at the short-term schemes. The United States, it's an exploding disaster, and I would avoid that.
Thank you. Colin, did you want to come back?
Yes, please. I don't really hear any incidences of good practice from other countries that could successfully be translated to Scotland. Do they exist or don't they? We've had some warnings from Professor Blanchflower and so on, but I don't hear anything positive that we could actually look at and where we could learn and adapt here.
Right, so has anybody got one thing they think they've seen abroad that we could bring here? Professor Blanchflower, you're putting your hand up. I think your microphone's off. Hold on a minute. Right, try again.
Yeah, sorry. So that we do know actually something, and I want to be helpful. What we've learned is that you don't have to go and create a giant bureaucracy like the Manpower Services Commission. You don't have to go and put up a great scheme like YTS and YOPS and so on. Jim Heckman, the Nobel Prize winner, has worked on this. And basically what you need to do is to try and fund things locally. This is employers and others will like this. What it turns out is what works in Glasgow doesn't work in Stirling. A master plan, which takes forever to implement, is of no use to anybody. So praise the Lord, we don't have to do any of that. In a sense, the answer is, you're all MP, Scottish MP. Give money to your town and let the town decide what to do with it, and monitor very closely what works. We know how to do that. But I mean, the evidence is local is best. So I'm not going to say to you, here's a plan for Scotland. If you do that, it's a disaster. But you say, each of you is going to come say, okay, I'm going to bring money to you and help the young. And each of you comes up with what works in Clydebank doesn't work in Nairn, right? So that's the thing that we've learned. Give local people, give the local MPs the money and say to them, go find schemes that will work. So the boot and shoe industry in one place, the steel and shipbuilding in another. So the answer is, we know the answer to it. Our research shows that all that stuff was nonsense. MPs play a big role in it, local towns and local councils, and you say, here's the program, maybe use your community college, use your university, go in there, and one size does not fit all. So I do have a really good answer to you. You folks play a big role in it. We're going to come to your constituency and we're going to say, let's go do something, and you sit down with all your people. And what we do centrally is we monitor it and make sure we're making a good investment. That's a good business plan. So I have the answer, I think.
Well, good. So, Russell, is that the answer? Is there another one?
No, I think really echo that looking for big shiny things in the time of a crisis might not be the right route to go. I think we mentioned a few though. We have mentioned the job guarantee schemes. We did that 10 years ago. I think we need to do that again for this crisis. Learning the lessons from last time. I've mentioned short working time schemes too, but to echo Professor Blanchflower's point, we have systems in place that can get opportunities to people quickly, and that's exactly what we need to do. A brand new system or set of systems isn't necessarily going to be the best at doing that. So it's about expanding what we've got, refocusing what we've got, and I think, done in the right way, that regional or local approach could be a very good one too.
Thank you. So I'm going to go to Andy Whiteman. Andy, localism, that's the answer. What do you think?
Oh, well, I'm here to ask the questions, not answer them. But no, I totally agree with Professor Bunce for local authorities. I think a lot of the. I just want to move on to some questions around how we can better support young people. So, for example, IPPR published a report in May demonstrating that there was going to be an exacerbation of inequalities between the working poor, which would include a lot of the young, and the asset-owning wealthy, in the sense that a lot of people getting business support are using that business support to pay their landlord. Renters in the private sector have to pay their landlord first, and those costs are quite significant. So what role can driving down the cost of living and the big costs of rent, energy, transport, particularly for young people who want to be mobile but also want to have a place to call home that's secure, what role does that play? And secondly, Russell Gunson did raise the question of the shorter working week initiative in France. And I'm very keen to hear if there's any significant work going on to ensure that the number of hours there are in the economy are shared out more fairly, because it seems to me that that's one key way in which young people, in terms of job guarantees, in terms of the work that Glasgow University, Professor Blanchflower was talking about, all these actors can do to absorb the talents, the time and the energies of young people. To perhaps start with Russell Gunson, because I mentioned his organisation's report.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the report back in May, it looked at, in essence, ultimately, where does the money that is being, the emergency funding going into the economy ending up, and who, in essence, is losing the least versus who is most through this part of the crisis. And of course, we've emphasised speed for all the reasons we've talked about as a country, and for good reason. And so some of the schemes have been designed in ways to get money out quickly rather than necessarily thinking through the effects of it or the distributional effects. But for example, around furlough, we find around 45% of the funds that have gone through businesses to employees will end up back with lenders and landlords. And that is, of course, good to keep people's roof above their heads and to keep their debts manageable, we hope. But whilst debt holidays or mortgage holidays exist for landlords, and whilst creditors are offering them to debtors, ultimately we haven't seen landlords and lenders asked to take a hit in the way that those that renters and debtors have and will. And so I'm not suggesting that we need to do anything on that now, but certainly when it comes to paying for the crisis, we need to keep that in mind. And so looking at rent caps, looking at how we can look at write-offs for debt built up through the crisis, whether that's like through council tax, housing association, more broadly, looking at those things could be as important as looking on the income side. But I do want to emphasise that that isn't something in the next week or two, that's something for the next few years, next Parliament, in fact. How do we make sure that we pay for this crisis in a way that's fair and that respects the fact that we owe a debt to a huge number of people that got us through this? Equally, there are whole sectors of the economy that should really owe a debt to us all for us helping them to get through this. So how do we get the other side of this, an economy that respects that is fairer, that also has climate justice at its heart? Those are the questions I think that we need to be getting our head up to soon, whilst also juggling some of the really short-term crisis kitchen sink issues that we've talked about already in this session.
Thank you, Russell. Does anybody else want to come in on that? Yeah, Mary?
Yeah, it's kind of building on the debt point that Russell made. We are hearing from quite a lot of businesses the amount of debt that they've taken on during the crisis. And overall in the business space, we're just hearing a story of fragility, I suppose, which does make you worry about the recovery. And if there was to be, more local lockdowns or second waves in terms of the business survival through the crisis, and what we're hearing is that those who have taken on debt, they're more likely to have taken on debt if they're more worried about their cash flow position and things like that. So it does sort of speak that there might be an issue coming where people have maybe deferred rent and have that debt on their books, and when that actually comes to be paid, whether the businesses can survive. So that's a further issue to worry about in the coming months, as well as the sort of unemployment that's coming.
Very much so. Professor Blanchflower, were you indicating that you wanted to come in? Yes.
Yeah, I think there's an inequality issue. So David Bell and I have written several papers on this. So it turns out that the young disproportionate, this is prior to the recession, the young's well-being was diminished by A, they couldn't get the kind of job they wanted, and B, if they had a job, it had fewer hours than they would like. Okay, so they are unhappy because they have fewer hours. But there's another side to this, which is actually it turns out that the old want fewer hours. So what happened with the old, and we should be mindful of this, think about in the Great Recession, people were planning on retiring. They couldn't because their assets fell and they continued to work. So they were forced to work longer. Sometimes they were forced to work 25 hours and they'd like to work 12. So there is some evidence that some kinds of reallocations can happen. But I think mindful to both points, David and I have a paper just out recently where we show both things make people unhappy, because the way an economist would put it, people are off their labour supply curve. So you would like to work X and you work more than X or less than X. That makes you, in equilibrium, makes you less happy. So there are things that we could be doing to try and make the allocation of hours better. That was prior to the recession. But be mindful that during this period, then there are people who are going to be unhappy because they wanted to retire, but now they can't. And so that has an implication too, right? And that's particularly when at Dartmouth, nobody retired in the faculty from 2008 to 2012 because they had defined contribution plans, and all of a sudden their plan to retire had gone. So we should be mindful that there's this other group who are going to be impacted too. They're going to have to stay in the labour force, and if they have retired, they're going to be out looking for work as well. And there's a sort of an unhappiness bit that we know is now going on.
Oh dear. Andy, do you want to come back?
I'll leave it there, convener. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So in that case, I'm moving to Dean Lockhart, please. Dean.
Thank you, convener. I'd like to follow up on the discussion around policy response, because in the past, as the panel will know, governments committee to shovel-ready projects as a means to create employment, including for young people. Now in the digital era, should we be looking at large-scale digital projects as a means of employing and training young people, but also taking into account the revolution in terms of business and services moving online? So in a sense, we're matching up a supply of young people in the employment market with the demand to move business and other services online.
Any takers for a response? Yeah, Professor Blanchflower?
Obviously, not every kid is going to be ready to do the digital stuff. But here's an obvious thing that universities are well placed for. They're extremely well placed to be able to do that. Think of the people graduating from the University of Stirling or Aberdeen or whoever who've been having trouble going to the labour market. These are obvious people that you could use within universities to help train people in the digital age. I mean, some of the Conservation Corps and some of these programs are going to be fairly high tech. So you've illustrated one. Think of the whole green debate. Some of that could be people out planting trees, but it also could be across the whole sort of digital perspective. There could be high tech things going on as well. So I think your point is very well taken. And go back to my local point, it might well be more of an issue in a town that has a university in it than maybe in a town that doesn't. So you might think in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and in Glasgow, and in Aberdeen, and in Stirling, those kind of places might, and where there's a local community college that's good at it. So I completely agree with you, but I think this is one of the things that you can do on a local basis, and it's probably going to be something that your universities and community colleges can be central to, and then also partnering with firms who often are actually located in those places around the universities too. But I think you're completely right, but it's a way that you can use the universities and do it in a local way.
Okay. So Russell Gunson, you wanted to come in. Russell.
Yeah, thank you. I think trying to direct funding centrally, we need to set broad parameters, broad priorities, broad missions, as the lingo would go. And absolutely see what at the local and regional level fits within that and build it at that point rather than centrally. Having said all that, just repeat what I said previously around those challenges that we faced going into this. Even before COVID, we had a big automation and digital revolution happening to us that we want to less happen to us in more shape. There was Brexit, there was climate, there was aging, and there were pre-existing economic inequalities. So any money or any policy priority through the programme for government, through the draft budget at the end of the year, through any spending review, and then of course into the next parliamentary term, it has to be about what boosts the economy quickly, what gets jobs quickly, but what also begins to play to those pre-existing challenges we face. So digital, I think, could be a big part of that. But crucially, that has to be at all levels. So universities have a place, but we know that actually that effect that Professor Blanchflower was talking about earlier, in harder times, young people in the labour market sort of drop down notches. So you'll find graduates taking jobs that previously college qualifiers would take, so on and so forth. So we need to make sure that it's at all skill levels, not just at the degree, graduate, postgraduate level.
Absolutely. Dean, did you want to come back?
Not so much on that. I had a specific follow-up question for Professor and for Fraser Vounder. For Professor Blanchflower, are we likely to see negative interest rates? And for the Fraser Vounder, do you still expect the GERS figures to be published on the 26th of August as per scheduled? Thank you.
Okay, so Professor Blanchflower first then. Are we going to see negative interest rates?
Well, what I said earlier, remember that in 2008, most of the things that have happened were unthinkable now. I think the expectation is that negative interest rates are clearly, from the conversation at the bank, it's clearly on the table now. Remember that the world's great central banks, the Japanese central bank, the European central bank, the Reichsbank, all have them. So I think the prospect is that it's on the table and probably will happen. I mean, the logic is that if you make an error on the fiscal front, for example, then inevitably what happens is the thing falls on the central bank, and the central bank has so few tools left. I mean, traditionally what you do in a recession is you get interest rates and you cut them by 500 basis points. Well, we got rates so low, and quantitative easing is so large with everybody around the world doing this. So your ability to do things is limited, and therefore you must take account of one weapon you have, which is negative rates. We did not think that negative rates could exist and operate, but it's clear that they can. The question you might follow up with, well, how low can they go? And the answer is lower than we thought.
Yeah, interesting thought. Mary, what's the Fraser-Allender's position then on the second point?
I'm still expecting the figures to be published. They've been pre-announced, as is the statistical process. So, unless Dean's heard anything, I'm certainly expecting them to be released on the 26th of August, and look forward to writing lots about them that week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, let's move to Gordon MacDonald then. Gordon.
Thanks, convener. We're aware that 80% of jobs are in the private sector, and 98% of those jobs are with companies or organisations with less than 50 employees. Now, we know that the latest figures from April 2020 in relation to young people going into positive destinations and remaining there for 9 months is at 93%, the third highest on record. And since 2009-10, the gap between youngsters going into positive destinations from the most and least deprived areas has halved. The Scottish Government is committed to the Scottish Job Guarantee and increased investment in developing the young workforce. So my question is this: given the crisis caused by the pandemic and the Brexit cliff face that we're about to face in December, is there a need to change procurement rules or grant conditions to protect the advances we've made in recent years in relation to youth unemployment and employment? And if so, what?
Anyone in particular?
Whoever wants to answer it.
Right. Okay, who wants to answer it? Don't all rush. Go on then, Russell.
Yeah, thank you. I can't say we're procurement experts, but clearly, there are more you can do within the current rules, and equally with Brexit, those rules may begin to change to enable some of these social clauses to be even stronger than or should I say stronger than they are now. And so looking at what other countries do with their procurement, with their government spending, there are clearly ways we can push that further and push the fair work or the youth employment or the developing young workforce agenda more strongly too. I think more broadly, there's a point here around conditionality on support, both to the economy as a whole, but to individual businesses too. And I think absolutely as we get into later this year and looking ahead to next, we need to begin to think through how we can get back what is in the best interests of business, the economy as a whole, but actually also in the interests of employees and the government as a whole. So delivering fair work, delivering inclusive growth is a win-win. How can we begin to push those agendas harder through this next period so that we, there's a consensus, at least rhetorically, on this, and I hate using the term to be honest, but how we can build back better, as everyone seems to want to do. That's great in rhetoric, but let's begin to think through how you can actually do that. For us, conditionality and support, we have to look at and how we can more, again, push those agendas a bit more strongly than the voluntary ways we've been doing it up to now.
Okay, thank you, Russell. Anybody else want to add to that? Back to Gordon. Gordon, do you want to add anything?
No, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask then quickly, I mean, one of the things we were aware of, there were some sectors that were underemployed. So, for example, we have gaps in the social care sector. So, do any of you have any thoughts around how we can encourage young people to refocus their ambitions into some of those sectors? Any thoughts? Yeah, go on then, Russell. You're good at volunteering.
I'm doing my bit. I think, usually when sectors struggle to recruit, the free market would suggest increasing pay would be one way to encourage people to come in. And clearly in social care, for example, we've got big problems, you heard in the previous session, around not only pay, but also terms and conditions more broadly. And that, I think, as we hope to exit the crisis in terms of the health side of this crisis, we'll see if that's true or not. We can't forget those that have got us through this, including, of course, both the paid care workforce, but equally the unpaid care infrastructure too. So I think on social care particularly, there's unfinished business that's probably been there from before COVID, if we're all honest, around pay, but also around terms and conditions, and beyond that, around routes for career progression, not just within care, but within health, within other parts of the economy too. And I think more broadly, again, there is the same sort of point around job quality that we started with. We cannot come through this crisis repeating the mistakes after the financial crash of promoting insecure work, gig economy work, self-employment, or low-paid self-employment. We have to learn our lessons and begin to, if you like, redistribute risk, pool it better than we have. Because if COVID has done one thing on the income side, on the economy side, it's exposed that we've pushed risk, huge amounts of risk, onto people that just cannot bear it in times of crisis. And we need to pool that in a much better way over the longer term.
Mary, you want to come in next, and then Professor Blanchflower afterwards? Yeah.
Yeah, just to build on that and the issues with social care, I think that it's exposed again the need to have an honest conversation about the broader funding of social care. So not just how we value the staff that work in it or the terms and conditions and the respect for their professionalism and the investment in their careers, but just the broader issue of funding social care. And there's been review after review on this, and I think various solutions proposed, and I think we just need to get comfortable that we'll all have to pay more to pool the risk on social care so that we're looked after when we're older. But it's important that conversation comes to the fore again, so that we have an honest conversation and put in place a sort of a sustainable system for social care.
And Professor Blanchflower.
I mean, I think the second one, you're completely right that this is a long-term behaviour change. I mean, we realise we've underinvested in care. I mean, look at the deaths that have occurred around the world in care homes. So that's a behavioural change. We're going to have to invest more in it. And Russell is right that the solution is, I mean, I'm a market guy. Relative prices are going to have to change. The way you're going to get kids to go to care, I mean, it looks an unbelievably unattractive place to go to. So the answer is you can allow the quality of the service to deteriorate further, but I think society's sort of taken the view that our care workers are really important, our nurses and our doctors are really important, and there's a rebalancing of the way we think of things. I just have one thought I wanted to just add to it. So I sat around this table, and the one thing I think we should think about is actually this: there is an opportunity here in the sense of when the long-term balance comes. This is the smallest cohort of young people we've seen for 20 years, and we're going to see for 20. So if you look back to 2008, we're talking about, now I was looking at my numbers, about 710,000 people under who are 16. It was about 850 in 2008. So at some point when we're back to balance and we're back to normal again, there's actually going to be a shortage of these young people. So the relative price will actually, I mean, we're talking 150,000 less people than there were 10 years ago. So that's obviously an issue. But I think you're right. I think a long-run change in behaviour, a repricing of things, and for kids to go to the care to social care, prices are going to have to rise because our investment in that care, both privately and publicly, is going to have to rise. There's one of the long-run changes in behaviour.
And quite possibly the model on which we operate is certainly going to have to change, I would think.
Yes. And it's
Richard.
Sorry, and it's going to cost more.
Yeah, it's definitely going to cost more, yeah. Richard Lyle, you wanted to pop in with a supplementary, so very quickly.
Yeah, basically what I'll come back to what Mr. Blanchflower was talking about. The Second World War, we only paid off the debt by the 31st of December 2006, nearly 60 years after the war, and we only at that time owed £21 billion. I'm sure that's 1945 prices. So we need to stimulate the economy, and would you agree possibly end OAP paying tax, re-profile older to retire with a decent pension, and possibly set up a social care fund similar to a national insurance payment? To the professor.
Maybe. I mean, I think, what would a professor say? Let's go and evaluate the costs, let's evaluate the returns, and decide if that's the best way to go compared to other options. But I think that's an option on the table. I always want people to think, if you do something, you change a tax, whatever, what's the behavioural response? How do people respond to it? Do they retire more? Do they retire less? So I think this is something on the table, but before going to it, we should evaluate what the consequences are and whether people's behaviour changes as a result of what you've said.
We didn't sit and count the cost of the bullets for the war, so we shouldn't sit and count the cost of re-evaluating and re-stimulating our economy.
That's not what I said. I agree completely with that, right? I agree completely that we should go forward. Then you've asked me which specific things should we do. Then I play the role of a professor, which says, yes, we should stimulate. Which measures should we do? Well, we should do the ones that generate the greatest return.
Thank you.
Right, Russell wanted to come in on that as well, and Mary, so we'll go to both of them to finish off. So, Russell?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think both on social care, but equally, I think Mary mentioned it earlier in the session, income protection insurance. Other Nordic, but also continental Europe countries had a furlough or similar scheme in place already going into this, hugely. And I think some of those behavioural changes that Professor Blanchflower talks about, and some of those sort of attitudinal changes in terms of what voters will vote for, opens up opportunities that haven't been there before. Whether Scotland going alone or whether it's a UK-wide, looking at that income protection insurance model and looking at how we could potentially do something similar. Social care, looking at how we absolutely, as we've already talked about, take the risk out of it, increase investment in it, increase quality in it. And I just raised, because we've not really raised it before in this session, but wealth taxes and that intergenerational justice point there. So looking at, it doesn't all need to be on income tax or national insurance, that could be in the mix. But looking at wealth, particularly as quantitative easing accumulates wealth for people with assets often, we may see that over the coming time. How do we claw some of that back as we go to pay for some of these new things that we want to learn the lessons from over this last 6 months, if not 10 years?
And Mary, you get the last word today. So.
Yeah, I was going to make pretty much the same point as Russell, that we can't just look at taxation of income, and we need to think about the place of wealth taxation, particularly given the accumulation of wealth and the way that exacerbates intergenerational inequalities, which has affected probably this generation of young people more than any other. So yeah, I'll just agree with what Russell said.
All right, well, thank you very much. I mean, I think that's been interesting, and clearly we're facing, quite a significant crisis for young people going forward if we don't act quickly and act thoughtfully. And we've heard a number of suggestions about how we can do that. And I suppose a big message, particularly from Professor Blanchflower, there isn't one size that fits all. localism is perhaps something we should be thinking a lot more about in terms of how we react to this. But I think we'll take away everything you've said and think very hard about it in terms of the advice we give as a committee. So can I thank you all very much for attending, and thank you, Professor Blanchefleur, for giving us your not so pleasant hours, shall we say, in terms of contributing. And to Russell and Mary, your contributions as always are much appreciated. So I'm going to end the session here, and that concludes the public part of this morning's meeting. And as previously agreed, we'll now move the meeting into private session. I'm going to suspend for 10 minutes, and then if members would please log on to the private session. Thank you.